like the Stones in the 60s, like the Stones. With Michael, I've recorded with him before Mötley Crüe, Roy Thomas Baker, and I love Roy as like a brother. The first record, we didn't have a producer.
Mick Mars has never been the first name mentioned when people talk about Mötley Crüe. He wasn't flashy like Tommy Lee, didn't live in scandal like Vince Neil, and didn't turn his life into a novel like Nikki Sixx. On stage, he would quietly stand in a corner, hunched over with black hair covering half his face, his hands slightly trembling, yet still delivering thick, heavy riffs, the very sound that made Crüe stand out in a noisy jungle of glam metal in the 80s. But then in 2022, after more than 4 decades of silent loyalty and dedication, Mick Mars stepped away from touring, tormented by ankylosing spondylitis. He thought he'd be honored like a warrior who had survived too long. But no, in just a few weeks, his name was erased from every promotional campaign. Those who once called him brother began saying he couldn't play anymore, that he was confused, and that he chose to step down. A legal battle broke out, and for the first time, the world saw clearly what that silent legend had endured for decades to keep a band from falling apart. Mick Mars's story isn't one of flashbulbs or glittering glory. It's the story of a man who played music through pain, was so loyal he made himself disappear, and was then cast aside as if he had never existed. But it is that very silence, that unwavering resolve, that made him the most unforgettable member of a band full of attention seekers. Join Rock Discovery as we follow the low notes of Mick Mars's life, a place where silence echoes louder than any scream. Early life. Before becoming the guitar soul of Mötley Crüe, Mick Mars was just a boy named Robert Allen Deal, born on May 4, 1951, in Terre Haute, Indiana. His childhood was far from easy, not because of extreme poverty, but because he always felt like he didn't belong anywhere. His family constantly moved from Indiana to Ohio and then to California, making Mick's early years a blur of relocation and disconnection. Every time he got used to a new school or a new neighborhood, it was time to pack up and leave again. This didn't just sever the few friendships he managed to form, it shaped him into a withdrawn, quiet child, a shell he would carry for life. Even as a kid, he was different. While other children played sports, Robert pressed his ear to vinyl records, listening to old blues, from B.B. King to Muddy Waters. While his peers chased after the pop trends of Elvis or the Beatles, he was drawn to the moaning, dark melodies, music that other kids didn't understand and adults often mocked. He started playing guitar at age 9, entirely by ear, because his parents couldn't afford formal lessons. The guitar was cheap, no one taught him. But every afternoon after school, the skinny boy would sit for hours, trying to mimic what he heard on records. A raw, instinctive way of learning that later shaped Mick Mars's unpolished yet strange playing style. His teenage years were marked by social isolation. He was shunned by peers for his unusual look: black leather jackets, long hair, skulls painted on his sleeves, and eyes always cast down toward the floor. Some teachers even labeled him a weirdo. But the real turning point didn't come until he was 17. When he began to feel a dull pain creeping along his spine. At first, it showed up when he played guitar, then when he bent over, and eventually, even when he walked. Doctors diagnosed him with ankylosing spondylitis, a chronic inflammatory disease that causes the vertebrae to fuse together, slowly turning the spine into a rigid column of bone. For a guitar-obsessed teenager, it was almost a death sentence. The disease had no cure and would only grow more merciless with time. "I was 19 but felt like an 80-year-old man," Mick once said. "And when you live in a body like that, you either learn to endure or you die slowly in bitterness." Mick chose to endure. No complaints, no surrender. He dropped out of high school, took his guitar, and left home to embark on a journey with no safety net. where physical pain was only a small part of the loneliness that came from being forgotten by the world before it even knew your name. Early career. In the 1970s, when California was spawning countless rock bands and dreams of stardom, Robert Allen Deal, now in his 20s, was still grappling with ankylosing spondylitis and a career that was virtually non-existent. He played in dozens of local bands like Whitehorse, Video Noir, or at small-time venues around Venice, but none of them lasted more than a few months. They all broke up, faded into obscurity, or were rejected by major record labels. At times, he had to live in an old van, doing everything from guitar tech to sound mixing just to get on stage. The talent was there, but his look was out of step with the times, and his blues-heavy style clashed with the disco and punk dominance of the era. More importantly, the name Robert Deal left no impression. In a world where the stage was a battleground of icons, he knew that if he didn't reinvent himself, he'd be buried forever. So he killed off Robert and was reborn as Mick Mars. That name didn't come from poetic inspiration, but from a clear declaration. Mick, like a rock flint, and Mars, the warrior planet. It was his way of putting on armor, cold, sharp, and no longer willing to lose. Then one day in 1980, he placed a small ad in the Recycler, a classified paper for the LA music scene. Loud, rude, aggressive guitar player available, blues-based, looking for a band with fire. That ad landed in the hands of two young men named Nicky Sixx and Tommy Lee, who were looking for a guitarist for their new band. They were struck by the badass guitar tone at the audition, but even more by his cold demeanor, all-black outfit, and the way he stood silently in a corner. In that moment, Mötley Crüe was born, with Nicky on songwriting, Tommy on drums, Vince Neil as the frontman, and Mick Mars as the architect of their sound. It was Mick who suggested the name Mötley Crüe, inspired by a drunken conversation where a friend had once described a band as a motley-looking crew. That name, with its faux umlauts, became an icon of the wild, freakish glam metal era. From a near decade of failure, Mick Mars quietly stepped into the core of one of the most explosive rock bands in America. But he didn't do it through scandal or flashy charisma. He did it with his guitar, the only thing that ever spoke the pain he could never put into words. Career success. When Mötley Crüe released their debut album, Too Fast for Love, in 1981, the world began to take notice of a strange new blend of punk, glam, and metal rising out of Los Angeles. But beneath Nicky Sixx's wild persona, Tommy Lee's acrobatic drumming, and Vince Neil's screeching vocals, there was one thing keeping it all from falling apart: the thick, eerie, thunderous sound of Mick Mars. No showboating, no noise, no public outbursts. Mick Mars let his guitar do the talking. It was him who laid down the hammer-heavy riffs of Live Wire, who delivered the searing solos of Looks That Kill, and who quietly held together the entire musical structure of Crüe, even if the world only ever saw the fire, not the furnace. During their golden era, from Shout at the Devil, 1983, Theater of Pain, 1985, Girls, 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 1987, to Dr. Feelgood, 1989, Mötley Crüe rose to global superstardom, platinum albums one after another, sold-out tours, hordes of screaming fans, media frenzy. The band became the embodiment of an unhinged sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle. But amid all the parties, accidents, and explosive scandals, Mick Mars was the only one who never lost himself. He didn't get hooked on heroin like Nicky, didn't drunkenly crash cars like Vince, didn't make sex tapes like Tommy. He simply played music. There were nights when the rest of the band lay passed out backstage from drugs and booze. Yet Mick was still there, waiting for showtime, spine bent in pain, but Stratocaster in hand. No one forced him to play, but he never missed a show. Not once. Ironically, even though Crüe's sound began with his guitar, fame began to outrun Mick's name. When MTV took over and image became everything, people remembered the backflipping drums, the platinum blonde hair, the screams, but not the man standing quietly on the left side of the stage, hunched over, the only one actually playing live. By the late 90s, Mick's role in the studio started to diminish. Some of his guitar parts were replaced by session players. His writing contributions were limited, but he didn't complain. No press conferences, no fights, no tell-all books, because to him, none of that mattered as much as one thing. As long as he could still stand, he would play, because that was the only thing that kept him truly alive. And somehow, that very silence, that near invisible presence, became the one thing that made Mick Mars an irreplaceable lifeblood in the stormy saga of Mötley Crüe. Conflict and rumors. After more than 4 decades of loyalty, no one thought Mick Mars, the man who had taken Mötley Crüe from dingy bars to stadium stages, would leave in bitterness. But the unthinkable turned out to be the harsh truth. In October 2022, Mick Mars announced he would step back from touring, citing health reasons. After over 40 years battling ankylosing spondylitis, his body could no longer handle the grueling, months-long tours. But he made it clear, this wasn't full retirement. He was still an official member, still held shares, and still intended to write and record music. Yet just weeks later, Mötley Crüe announced that John 5 would be taking over completely, and that Mick Mars had retired permanently. No joint press release, no farewell photo, no tribute. His name vanished from promotional campaigns, while the other members began issuing statements that were as cold as they were cruel. The situation escalated in April 2023 when Mick Mars filed a lawsuit against the band, alleging they held a private shareholders meeting to force him to give up his stake and remove his name from the business entities managing Mötley Crüe. According to the lawsuit, they cut his profit share from 25% down to just 5%, claiming he could no longer perform live, despite the fact that he was the only one actually playing fully live on the most recent tour, while the others relied on backing tracks. Mick also accused the band of smearing his reputation, claiming he was mentally confused, attempting to discredit him in the eyes of both the media and fans. In response, Mötley Crüe pushed back hard. Nikki Sixx claimed Mick couldn't keep time anymore, and that they had to prop him up on stage. Manager Alan Kovacs even used the term elder abuse, suggesting that Mick was being exploited by his own legal team. Tommy Lee stayed silent, but leaked sources said he supported the band reboot, saying it was time. What once seemed like unbreakable brotherhood suddenly shattered, as if it had never existed. Mick Mars, who had never publicly criticized anyone in 40 years, was now forced to take his own band to court just to reclaim his name and dignity. In the rare interviews that followed, he didn't lash out. He didn't name names. He simply said one sentence that sent a chill through the rock world. "I didn't retire. I was pushed out." This wasn't a fight for money. It was a man, hunched from disease, drained from touring, still trying to hold on to the dignity of an artist he had spent his entire life being. In a rock world full of scandals, drugs, and betrayal, Mick Mars's long silence finally broke. Not with a scream, but with a quiet, gut-wrenching sob from a warrior cast out by his own family. Personal life. Mick Mars is perhaps one of the most private figures in the rock scene of the 1980s. While the rest of Mötley Crüe were surrounded by scandals, wild parties, and fleeting marriages, Mick chose to stay away from cameras, away from tabloids, and away from anything that might make him lose control. He was once married in his younger years and has a son, but he has rarely, if ever, spoken publicly about them. During those years spent in the shadows of the music world, he also had a few short-lived relationships, most of which ended due to his declining health and a reserved nature that left partners feeling uneasy. But none of that ever made him change. Mick Mars never tried to be easy to understand. He simply was who he was, a man who lived with pain, music, and silence. In 2007, during a backstage photo shoot, Mick met Serena Schonenberger, a Swiss model 33 years his junior. Despite the age gap, the two quickly formed an unusual bond. Serena wasn't a Mötley Crüe fan, nor was she someone chasing fame. She was drawn to Mick's solitude, his quiet demeanor, and his honesty, a man she described as surprisingly warm. They began dating, and in 2013, they were officially married in a private ceremony. In the few photos ever shared, Mick wore simple black, his arm gently wrapped around his wife's waist, his smile quietly content. A rare sight after decades in Mötley Crüe. Since then, Serena has remained by his side, on stage, in the studio, and through countless hospital visits for his spinal condition. Their married life has never been flashy. No extravagant wedding photos, no loud social media presence, just quiet afternoons in Nashville where they live privately in a small home, care for their pets, and spend time with music. On a personal level, Mick was never perfect. In the 1990s, when his back pain became unbearable, he became dependent on opioids, taking up to 45 Advils a day. At one point, he experienced severe hallucinations, even claiming to see aliens in his bedroom, something he now recounts with a hint of self-mockery. But unlike many rockers of his era, Mick never blamed the past or his illness. He never sought pity. He just quietly endured. And if there's one thing that made him stand out in a band full of noise, it's this. In a sea of men who screamed, he was the only one who knew when to be silent, just enough to keep himself from breaking. Legacy and influence. In a world where the spotlight is often reserved for the loudest voices, Mick Mars chose to step back and let his guitar speak for him. But it was that very retreat, that unwavering silence, that etched his name into rock history in a way that cannot be erased. Mick Mars didn't invent heavy metal, nor did he lay the foundations of glam rock. But he bridged those two worlds with a sound that was uniquely his. Deep riffs, heavy riffs, riffs soaked in mood and impossible to shake off. The sound of Crüe was chaos, but the soul of their music, that was Mick. From Live Wire to Girls, 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 from Shout at the Devil to Dr. Feelgood, it was Mick who laid the groundwork for what would become the sleaze metal sound, dirty, sexy, and raw, emblematic of the 80s. As one producer once said, "No one creates that stalking, burning sensation like Mick Mars. His notes don't explode out of the amp. They creep, pulse, and wrap around you like a ghost with a heartbeat." What made him stand out was that he never needed to be fast. In an era where guitar heroes fired off lightning-speed solos, Mick played slow, with space, prioritizing emotion over technique. That very approach made him a model for later guitarists seeking psychological depth in their riffs. From Jim Root, Slipknot, Wes Borland, Limp Bizkit, to Jerry Cantrell, Alice in Chains. All have cited Mars as a shadow inspiration, the kind of influence that never graced magazine covers but bled into every breakdown and riff structure. Beyond Crüe, he helped shape the image of the wounded guitarist, an artist who plays to survive. In a time when rock flirted with fashion, Mick stuck to his own script. Hair in his eyes, black clothes, boots, a bent spine, but every note he played felt like it could be his last. No sex scandals, no media games, no chasing trends. Mick Mars was never a star. He was a pillar, the anchor that kept the band from crashing headfirst into chaos. And when he left, Crüe, though still alive, no longer sounded like Crüe. In 2024, at age 73, he released his first solo album, The Other Side of Mars, a belated but defiant manifesto. Not to remind the world that he was still alive, but to declare that he had never been silenced. That album holds everything Mötley Crüe never let him say. the frustration, the loneliness, the rage, and the pride of an artist who never bowed his head, even as his back gave out. Life today. After everything he's been through, the blazing stages, the blood-soaked tours, the silent betrayals, Mick Mars no longer has to stand hunched in front of thousands of fans, nor fight for his place in a band that no longer has a place for him. He lives quietly in Nashville with his younger wife, Serena, in a small home filled with instruments and greenery. No social media, no rebuttals, no need for the press to remember his name daily. But don't mistake his silence for retreat. Mick Mars has never stopped playing music. He's just no longer playing it for anyone but himself. In 2024, he released The Other Side of Mars, his long-awaited solo debut years in the making. It wasn't a comeback. It was a musical confession. Fierce, dark, grungy, heavy. But above all, honest. For the first time in his life, he was able to write, play, and speak with his own voice, unfiltered by the band, the label, or the producer. And he's not done. Entering 2025, Mick has already begun working on his second solo album, again with producer Chris Collier, someone who understands how to work with an artist who breathes pain like air. Mick revealed he's completed at least 4 new tracks, promising to explore emotional terrain even deeper than before. If all goes well, the album is set for release in late 2025 or early 2026, a new milestone that proves his creative fire never went out, even as his body fades with time. He's turned down all tour invitations, not out of fear, but out of honesty. He knows his limits. He only considers small, select performances, and only if they feel necessary. No reunion dreams, no craving for apologies. For Mick Mars, silence is the final form of freedom. In an early 2025 interview, when asked if there was anything left that troubled him, Mick gave a short reply. "I just want to be remembered as a guitar player, not as the guy who got kicked out of the band he helped start." At this final stretch of the road, he no longer needs the spotlight. He just needs a guitar, a quiet room, and a wife who understands that some notes hurt so deeply they can only be played, not spoken. Mick Mars is not a star in the Hollywood sense. He didn't rise on scandal nor climb through spectacle. He didn't need to charm the media or shout to be heard. He simply kept walking, slowly, hunched, in pain, but never stopping. For over 40 years with Mötley Crüe, he was the steady heartbeat in a chaotic world. Where friends fell to drugs, fame was built on scandal, and everything could change overnight. Mick didn't change. Even when overshadowed, drowned out, or pushed aside, he held on to the one thing that mattered, playing music as if it were the last thing he could ever do right. And in the end, when all the screaming fades, when the glory that once blinded millions has drifted into memory, there remains a man with no regrets, no bitterness, quietly stepping off stage, with his guitar strings still intact. Mick Mars doesn't need forgiveness, he doesn't seek praise, but he deserves to be heard, not just with ears, but with your heart. If you ever found yourself lost in Live Wire, screaming along to Shout at the Devil, or frozen by the opening riff of Dr. Feelgood, then you've already heard Mick Mars. Share your thoughts about this silent warrior in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Rock Discovery, where we continue to honor legends who never needed to shout to be remembered forever.